Too wild to be tamed, Apache Girl was locked away until Lonely Rancher gave her freedom and his heart. The iron bars felt cold against her palms as she pressed her face between them, watching the dust clouds rise from the horizon. Something was coming. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about freedom, captivity, and the strange ways of the white man's heart. But to understand how Ayanna Crowfeather ended up in that windowless cell in Fort Defiance, Arizona territory, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to a day when the desert sun burned so fierce it could melt a man's resolve into nothing more than a puddle of regret. The raid happened at dawn, just as the morning light painted the Chiricahua Mountains purple and gold. Ayanna had been gathering medicinal herbs near the sacred springs when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory like wind through pine branches. When the white soldiers come, you run like the deer, silent and swift. She should have listened. Instead, she climbed higher up the rocky outcrop, her bare feet finding purchase on stone her ancestors had walked for countless generations. From her perch, she could see them clearly now, a cavalry patrol, 20 men strong, their blue uniforms stark against the red earth. They moved with purpose, not the lazy meandering of a routine patrol. They were hunting. The young Apache woman's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them surround her family's hidden camp below. Her people had been careful, so careful, to stay invisible since the government's latest decree demanding all Apaches surrender to the reservations. But someone had talked. Someone always talked when the soldiers offered enough silver or whiskey. Her younger brother Nahul broke from the brush first, running toward the horses with the desperate speed of youth. The crack of rifle fire split the morning air like thunder, and Ayanna watched in horror as he stumbled, clutching his shoulder, red seeping through his fingers. That was when something inside her snapped. Later, the soldiers would tell stories about the Apache girl who came screaming down that mountainside like a wildcat, a curved knife flashing in each hand, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner. They would speak in hushed tones about how she fought 3 men at once before they finally wrestled her to the ground. How even with her hands bound, she spat curses in 2 languages that made hardened cavalrymen cross themselves. But in that moment, all Ayanna knew was rage pure and clean as mountain snow. The commanding officer, a thin man with premature gray streaking his beard, looked down at her with something that might have been admiration mixed with frustration. His name was Colonel Marcus Whitmore, and he had been chasing Apache raiders for 7 years without ever catching one alive who fought like this girl did. "What's your name?" he asked in broken Apache, his pronunciation making the beautiful language sound clumsy and foreign. Ayanna lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the endless sky, defiant and unbroken despite the rope burns on her wrists and the cut bleeding sluggishly above her left eyebrow. "I am Wind Through the Canyon," she replied in perfect English, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue. "I am Shadow on the mountain. I am what you will never capture, though you cage my body." Colonel Whitmore blinked, clearly taken aback by her fluency. Most Apache he encountered spoke only fragments of English, if any at all. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" "The missionary's wife taught me before your people killed her," Ayanna said flatly. "She said words were weapons sharper than any blade." I think she was right. The irony was not lost on the colonel. Here was an Apache woman who could articulate her hatred of his people with perfect grammar and pronunciation that would have impressed a Boston schoolmarm. It made everything infinitely more complicated. "You killed 2 of my men," he said. "Only 2?" Ayanna's lip curled in what might have been disappointment. "I must be losing my touch." What followed was a 4-day journey to Fort Defiance that tested everyone's endurance. Ayanna rode with her hands bound to the saddle horn, refusing all offers of food and water, her silence more unsettling than any screaming rage would have been. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves, casting nervous glances at their prisoner. On the 2nd day, Private Tommy Morrison made the mistake of reaching for her water canteen to force hydration. Ayanna's teeth sank into his wrist so deep she hit bone. He still bore the crescent-shaped scars 20 years later, and would tell his grandchildren about the Apache girl who was more wolf than woman. "Chain her hands behind her back," Colonel Whitmore ordered after that incident, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "Sir," Sergeant Hayes ventured carefully, "she hasn't eaten or drunk anything in 2 days. She'd die before we reached the fort." The colonel studied his prisoner, noting the way she sat straighter despite her obvious exhaustion, how her eyes never stopped scanning the horizon for escape routes that would never come. "She eat when she's ready to survive," he said finally. "Women like her, they don't die easy." He was right, though it took until the 4th morning for hunger to finally override pride. Ayanna accepted a piece of hardtack and a sip of warm water, but only after making it clear through her bearing that this was a tactical decision, not surrender. Fort Defiance squatted against the desert landscape like a brown scar, its adobe walls baking under the relentless Arizona sun. Established in 1851 to control the Navajo and Apache populations, it had grown into a sprawling complex of barracks, storehouses, and administrative buildings that represented everything Ayanna despised about the white man's way of imposing order on the wild. The jail was a separate building behind the main compound, constructed of thick stone walls that stayed cool even in the blazing heat of summer. There were 6 cells, but Ayanna was the only prisoner who required the special accommodations of leg irons and daily inspections. "This is temporary," Colonel Whitmore explained on her first day, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Washington is deciding what to do with you. Until then, you stay here." "How long is temporary?" Ayanna asked, testing the weight of the shackles around her ankles. "Could be weeks. Could be months. Could be years," she said, and it was not a question. The colonel had no answer for that. Her cellmate for the first week was a Navajo man named Joseph Begay, arrested for leaving the reservation without permission to visit his dying mother. He was quiet and gentle, spending his days weaving small baskets from grass he somehow smuggled in from the exercise yard. "Why do you fight so hard?" he asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the stone walls orange through their small, barred window. "Fighting only brings more pain." Ayanna considered the question seriously. In Apache culture, wisdom often came through careful observation and patience, qualities the white soldiers never seemed to understand. "When I was small," she said finally, "my grandmother told me about the first horses our people ever saw. Spanish conquistadors rode them across our lands like gods, and our warriors were afraid. But one young brave studied those creatures for many days. He learned they were just animals, strong but not magic. When he finally captured and tamed a wild Mustang, our people were no longer powerless against the Spanish." "And you think understanding the white man's ways will help you escape?" "I think understanding anything gives you power over it," Ayanna replied, "even if that power is simply knowing how to endure." Joseph was released after 10 days, leaving Ayanna alone with her thoughts and the steady rhythm of military life beyond her cell walls. She learned the schedule by heart: reveille at 5:30, morning inspection at 6, mess call at 6:30, evening retreat at sunset. The predictability of it should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a slow suffocation. The guards rotated every 12 hours. Corporal Jenkins, a young man from Ohio with kind eyes and a nervous habit of jingling his keys, brought her meals and tried to make conversation. Sergeant Martinez, older and harder, treated her with professional courtesy but kept his distance. It was clear he had dealt with Apache prisoners before and learned not to underestimate them. "You speak English better than most white folk I know," Corporal Jenkins observed one afternoon as he slid her dinner tray through the slot in the cell door. "The missionary's wife was very thorough," Ayanna replied, not looking up from the book she had been allowed to borrow from the post library. Robinson Crusoe, a story about survival and solitude that felt painfully relevant. What else did she teach you? Ayanna finally raised her eyes, studying the young soldier's face for signs of mockery or ulterior motive. Finding neither, she decided to answer honestly. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Some history, though I suspect her version was missing important details. French, because she said educated women should know languages. Piano, though there was no piano in our camp. She paused, remembering gentle hands guiding her fingers across imaginary keys drawn in the dust. She said music was the language of the soul. Do you miss her? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Miss her? Sarah Elizabeth Morrison had been the closest thing to a mother Ayanna had known after her own died in a cavalry raid when she was 12. The missionary woman had appeared in their mountain camp like a ghost, half dead from thirst and sun exposure, clutching a Bible and speaking fractured Apache with desperate determination. For 3 years, she had lived among them, learning their ways while sharing her own knowledge. She taught children to read using letters scratched in sand, translated Apache stories into English and English stories into Apache, slowly building bridges between worlds that seemed destined for war. Then the influenza came, and Sarah Elizabeth Morrison died along with 17 others in a winter that froze the stream solid for 3 months. Yes, Ayanna said simply, I miss her every day. The weeks blended together like watercolors in rain. Ayanna's world shrank to the dimensions of her cell, 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls thick enough to muffle sound and a ceiling high enough that she could not touch it even standing on her cot. The monotony was broken only by brief exercise periods in a small courtyard surrounded by 20-foot walls, where she could see a patch of sky and remember what freedom felt like. It was during one of these exercise periods that she first saw him. He was standing at the hitching post outside the fort's main gates, adjusting his stirrups with the careful precision of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. Even from a distance, she could see he was different from the soldiers and townspeople who usually visited Fort Defiance. His clothes were practical rather than fancy leather chaps worn soft with use. A shirt that had seen many washings, boots that were scuffed but well maintained. But it was his posture that caught her attention. He stood with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Neither aggressive nor submissive, just present in a way that suggested he had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. When he turned his head, she caught a glimpse of his profile's strong jaw, weathered skin that spoke of years under the desert sun, dark hair that needed cutting. He was probably 30 or so, old enough to have learned patience, but young enough to still believe in possibilities. Their eyes met across the courtyard for perhaps 3 seconds, no more. His were the color of river stones, gray-green with flecks of brown, and they held her gaze without the typical mixture of curiosity and fear she had grown accustomed to seeing in white men's faces. Then Sergeant Martinez was calling for her to return to her cell, and the moment was broken. But something had changed in those 3 seconds, though Ayanna would not understand what until much later. His name was Caleb Macready, and he owned a ranch 15 miles northeast of the fort, in a valley where a spring-fed creek provided year-round water for cattle and the occasional wild mustang. He had come to Fort Defiance to file a complaint about rustlers, but what he found instead was a question that would haunt him for weeks. "Who's the Apache girl in your jail?" He asked Colonel Whitmore over whiskey that evening, trying to keep his tone casual. "Ayanna Crowfeather," the colonel replied, refilling both their glasses with hands that were not entirely steady. The pressures of command were wearing on him, and it showed in the new lines around his eyes, the slight tremor that appeared when he thought no one was looking. "Caught her 3 months ago after she killed 2 of my men trying to protect her family. 3 months is a long time for a temporary prisoner." Colonel Whitmore studied his whiskey as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Washington keeps sending telegrams asking for more information. They can't decide if she's a prisoner of war, a criminal, or just another Indian to be relocated. Meanwhile, she sits in that cell reading Shakespeare and learning to speak French from a book. Shakespeare? Caleb's eyebrows rose. How does an Apache girl know Shakespeare? Missionary woman taught her before she died. Apparently, the girl has a mind like a steel trap. Speaks English better than most territorial legislators, writes in a script that would make a finishing school headmistress weep with envy. The colonel took a long sip of whiskey. It makes everything more complicated, you understand. Hard to think of her as just another savage when she can quote Hamlet and discuss philosophy. Caleb said nothing, but his mind was working. He had been ranching in Arizona Territory for 8 years, long enough to develop his own opinions about the Apache people that did not always align with official military policy. He had seen their skill as horsemen, their intimate knowledge of the land, their fierce loyalty to family and tradition. He had also seen what happened when two cultures collided with the force of historical inevitability. What will happen to her? Honestly, I don't know. Colonel Whitmore set down his glass with the careful precision of a man who had consumed just enough alcohol to loosen his tongue, but not enough to completely abandon discretion. She's too dangerous to release, too valuable as a prisoner to execute, and too educated to simply disappear into a reservation. It's a hell of a situation. Valuable how? She knows things. Apache hiding places, water sources, trails that don't appear on any map. She could be useful if she could be convinced to cooperate. But convincing her of anything requires getting past that wall of pride and anger she's built around herself. The conversation moved on to other topics: cattle prices, territorial politics, the never-ending challenge of finding reliable ranch hands, but Caleb's thoughts kept returning to the Apache girl he had glimpsed for those brief seconds. There had been something in her eyes, a quality he recognized but could not quite name. It was only later, riding back to his ranch under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, that he realized what he had seen. It was the same look he caught in his own mirror some mornings, the expression of someone who had learned to survive alone but had never stopped hoping for something more. His ranch house sat in a natural meadow where Willow Creek made a lazy bend around a grove of cottonwood trees. Caleb had built it himself over the course of 2 summers, using local stone for the foundation and timber hauled down from the mountains for the walls and roof. It was not large, 4 rooms plus a kitchen and a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, but it was solid and comfortable and completely his own. The silence greeted him like an old friend as he unsaddled his horse and turned the animal out into the corral. 8 years of bachelor living had taught him to appreciate solitude, but lately the quiet had begun to feel more like loneliness. He was 31 years old, financially stable, and possessed of a reputation for fairness in his business dealings. By any reasonable measure, he should have been considering marriage, raising a family, building something larger than himself. Instead, he spent his evenings reading by lamplight and his mornings riding fence lines, content but not entirely satisfied with the life he had created. The problem, if it was a problem, was that he had never met a woman who could match the landscape he loved. The few single women in the territory were either fresh arrivals from back east who wilted under the desert sun, or daughters of established families who wanted husbands with political ambitions and social connections Caleb had no interest in acquiring. He wanted someone who understood that freedom was not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice. Someone who could see beauty in a sunrise over the Chiricahua, mountains and strength in the way saguaro cacti survived decades of drought. Someone who would not try to civilize him or tame him or convince him that happiness could only be found in places with more people and fewer stars. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Corporal Jenkins arrived at first light, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the weight of bad news. "Mr. Macready, Colonel Whitmore needs to see you at the fort. It's about the Apache girl." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What's happened?" "She tried to escape last night. Damn near succeeded too." If Sergeant Martinez hadn't been checking the locks one extra time, double quotes, Jenkins shook his head. She's in solitary now, but the colonel thinks she might try again. He wants to discuss options. The ride to Fort Defiance felt longer than usual, though Caleb pushed his horse harder than was strictly wise. By the time he reached the fort, the sun was high enough to make the adobe walls shimmer with heat, and his shirt was soaked with sweat that had little to do with the temperature. Colonel Whitmore was waiting in his office, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. His uniform was impeccable as always, but his face showed the strain of a man who had slept poorly and woken to problems that had no clear solutions. "Macready, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "We have a situation." "So I heard. How close did she come?" 6 inches. The colonel held up his thumb and forefinger to demonstrate. 6 inches of rusted metal was all that stood between her and open desert. She had picked the lock on her cell door, disabled the guard. "Don't worry. Jenkins is fine, just a bruised ego and a knot on his head, and was working on the outer door when Martinez found her." Caleb felt a reluctant admiration for the girl's resourcefulness. "How did she pick the lock?" "Hairpin, apparently. Fashioned it into lockpicks somehow. We've searched her cell 3 times since then and found nothing else, but—" Colonel Whitmore spread his hands helplessly. "She's too smart, Macready, too determined. If I keep her here much longer, she will escape, and when she does, she'll disappear into country where we'll never find her. Maybe that would solve your problem. Maybe. Or maybe she'll bring back information about our defenses to Apache raiders who are still fighting the resettlement. Either way, I can't take the risk." The colonel sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "I need an alternative solution." "What kind of alternative?" Colonel Whitmore met his eyes directly, and Caleb saw desperation there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "I need someone to take responsibility for her. Someone trustworthy, with property isolated enough that escape would be difficult but not impossible. Someone who can provide gainful employment that would satisfy the territorial authorities, while keeping her away from her people long enough for the situation to stabilize." The implications of what the colonel was suggesting hit Caleb like a physical blow. "You want me to take her to my ranch. I want you to consider it as an alternative to indefinite imprisonment or worse." Colonel Whitmore leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the desktop. "You asked what would happen to her, Macready. The truth is, Washington is losing patience. There's talk of transferring her to a federal prison in Kansas, or to one of the industrial schools they're using to civilize Indian children. At 20 years old, she'd be the oldest student they've ever had, and the process ... He did not finish the sentence, but both men knew what those schools did to break the spirit of native children. "What makes you think she would cooperate with any arrangement I might offer?" "Honestly, I don't know that she would. But I know she's too intelligent not to recognize a better option when she sees one. And I think you're the kind of man who might be able to reach her." "Based on what?" Colonel Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, studying Caleb's face as if trying to read something written there in a language he did not quite understand. "Based on the fact that you asked about her in the first place," he said finally, "and based on the way she looked at you yesterday when you were leaving the fort." For just a moment, her expression changed. It was subtle, but I've been watching her for 3 months, and it was the first time I've seen anything other than anger or resignation in her face. Caleb felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed to be so transparent. "I don't know anything about managing a prisoner." "She wouldn't be a prisoner, not exactly. The territorial government has provisions for employing Indian individuals as domestic workers or ranch hands, with proper supervision and quarterly reports. It's been used before, mostly with Navajo men who have skills the ranchers need. And if she runs, then you report it to me and we deal with the situation as it develops. But Macready," Colonel Whitmore's voice dropped to a more personal register, "if she stays here much longer, Something bad is going to happen. She's too proud to break, but pride can kill a person just as surely as a bullet. I've seen it before. The weight of decision settled on Caleb's shoulders like a mantle he had not asked to wear. Outside the office window, he could see soldiers drilling in the parade ground, their movements precise and synchronized, every action dictated by regulations that had been tested over decades of military experience. But this situation existed outside the boundaries of any regulation he knew. It required judgment calls and moral courage and a willingness to accept responsibility for consequences that could not be predicted or controlled. "I'd like to speak with her first," he said finally. Relief flickered across Colonel Whitmore's face, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "Of course, that's reasonable. And I want to be clear about something. If I do this, it's not because I think she needs saving or civilizing or any other kind of white man's charity. It's because I think she deserves a chance to choose her own fate, even if the choices are limited. Understood? And if it doesn't work out, for any reason, I'll bring her back with no questions asked." "Fair enough." Colonel Whitmore stood up, straightening his uniform jacket with hands that were steadier than they had been earlier. "Shall we go see if she's interested in hearing your proposal?" The walk to the jail felt like a march to judgment, though Caleb could not say whether he would be judging Ayanna or she would be judging him. The afternoon heat had reached that point where the air itself seemed to shimmer, and the adobe walls of the fort radiated warmth like the sides of an oven. Sergeant Martinez was waiting outside the jail building, his keys jingling softly as he selected the right one for the outer door. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had seen enough of human nature to no longer be surprised by its extremes. But there was something in his eyes that suggested Ayanna Crowfeather had managed to earn his respect even as she remained his prisoner. "She's been quiet since this morning," he reported to Colonel Whitmore in a low voice. "No food, no water, no requests. Just sitting on her cot reading that book about the shipwrecked sailor. Any signs of planning another escape attempt?" "Hard to say, sir. She's always thinking about something, but she keeps her thoughts to herself." The interior of the jail was mercifully cooler than the outside air, though it carried the institutional smell of disinfectant and human desperation that Caleb recognized from his brief stint in a Kansas City jail years earlier when he had been young and foolish enough to get into a bar fight with the wrong men. Ayanna's cell was the last one in the corridor, positioned so that she could not see or communicate easily with any other prisoners. Through the bars, Caleb could see her sitting cross-legged on her narrow cot, her back straight and her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders like a curtain. She was indeed reading, her finger moving slowly across the page as if she were savoring each word. She looked up when their footsteps echoed in the corridor, and once again Caleb felt the impact of her direct gaze. In the lamplight, her eyes seemed even darker than he remembered, and he could see now that her face bore the kind of classical beauty that artists spent years trying to capture on canvas-high cheekbones, perfectly proportioned features, skin the color of burnished copper. But it was her bearing that truly impressed him. Despite months of imprisonment, despite the rough prison dress and the absence of any personal possessions, she carried herself with the dignity of a queen receiving visitors in her court. "Miss Crowfeather," Colonel Whitmore said formally, "this is Caleb Macready. He owns a ranch north of here, and he has a proposition he would like to discuss with you." Ayanna closed her book carefully, using a strip of fabric torn from her dress as a bookmark, and stood with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving silently through difficult terrain. "Mr. Macready," she said, inclining her head slightly. Her voice carried no hostility, but no warmth either. It was the tone of someone conducting necessary business with a stranger. "Miss Crowfeather." Caleb found himself oddly nervous, like a schoolboy called upon to recite in front of the class. "I understand you might be interested in alternatives to your current situation." "That would depend on the alternatives being offered." Her English was indeed flawless, carrying just enough of her native accent to make it musical without being difficult to understand. Caleb could see why Colonel Whitmore found her so unsettling. There was something disconcerting about trying to maintain cultural superiority over someone who could articulate her thoughts more clearly than most territorial legislators. "I'm looking for someone to help manage my household and assist with ranch operations," Caleb said, choosing his words carefully. "The work would include cooking, cleaning, basic bookkeeping, and helping with horses. In return, you would receive wages, room and board, and considerably more freedom than you currently enjoy." Ayanna's expression did not change, but Caleb sensed that she was processing every nuance of his offer, looking for hidden traps or unspoken expectations. "And if I chose to leave?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Caleb realized that his answer would determine whether any trust was possible between them. "Then you would leave," he said simply, "though I would ask that you give me adequate notice so I could make other arrangements." "You would not try to stop me?" "No." "You would not report my departure to the military authorities?" This was trickier territory, and Caleb could feel Colonel Whitmore's tension beside him. The truth was that he would be legally obligated to report any departure, but the timing and manner of that report could vary considerably. "I would fulfill my legal obligations," he said finally, "but those obligations would be satisfied by filing the appropriate paperwork within a reasonable time frame." Ayanna's lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. She had caught the careful phrasing and understood its implications. He was offering her a head start should she choose to run. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why would you offer employment to an Apache woman who killed 2 soldiers and tried to escape from military custody?" It was a fair question, and one that Caleb had been asking himself since Colonel Whitmore first made the suggestion. The honest answer was complicated, involving loneliness and curiosity and a growing sense that the conventional wisdom about Indian-white relations might be missing important truths. But honesty was the only currency that would have any value in this negotiation. "Because I think you deserve better than indefinite imprisonment for defending your family," he said. "And because I need help with work that requires intelligence and reliability, qualities that seem to be in short supply around here. You know nothing about me except what the Colonel has told you. How can you be certain I possess those qualities?" Caleb gestured toward the book in her hands. "Because you're reading Robinson Crusoe in a language that is not your native tongue, and you managed to pick a military lock with a hairpin. Those things require intelligence. And because you've survived 3 months in this cell without losing your mind or your dignity, which requires reliability of a very high order." For the first time since he had begun speaking, Ayanna's expression shifted slightly, not quite softening, but losing some of its defensive edge. "What kind of ranch do you operate, Mr. Macready?" "Cattle mostly, though I keep some horses for breeding and personal use. About 500 acres along Willow Creek with good water and grass. I run maybe 200 head, depending on the year and the market." "How far from this fort?" 15 miles northeast, in country that's mostly open range with some broken terrain along the creek bottom." Ayanna nodded, and Caleb could practically see her calculating distances, escape routes, and tactical advantages. The thought did not alarm him as much as it probably should have. "Do you live alone?" "Yes." "No wife? No children?" "No." "No other employees?" "I hire seasonal help during roundup and branding, but most of the year it's just me." Another nod, more calculations. Caleb began to understand why she had been so successful at evading capture. For so long her mind worked like a chess player's, always thinking several moves ahead. "If I accepted your offer," she said slowly, "what assurance would I have that you would honor the terms as you've described them?" "You would have my word, the word of a white man I have known for 5 minutes." Caleb felt heat rise in his cheeks, but before he could respond, Ayanna continued. "However, it appears to be the only option available to me that does not involve continued imprisonment or transportation to places that would be considerably worse than this cell." She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes moving from Caleb's face to Colonel Whitmore's and back again. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. "I will accept your offer, Mr. Macready, with the understanding that either of us may terminate the arrangement at any time." "Agreed. And I will require a horse." Colonel Whitmore started to speak, but Caleb held up a hand to stop him. "That can be arranged. Not a plow horse or an old mare put out to pasture. A real horse, capable of covering ground if the need arises. I have several good horses. You can choose the one that suits you." Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. Apparently, she had expected him to refuse this particular demand. "In that case, I believe we have an agreement." The paperwork took another hour as territorial bureaucracy ground through its prescribed procedures for transferring custody of an Indian prisoner to civilian supervision. Caleb signed forms declaring his financial responsibility for Ayanna's actions, his commitment to provide regular reports on her employment status, and his understanding that harboring a fugitive was a federal offense punishable by imprisonment. While Colonel Whitmore handled the administrative details, Caleb found himself studying his new employee. He supposed that was what she was now, and wondering what he had gotten himself into. She sat quietly in the chair beside his, her hands folded in her lap and her expression giving nothing away. The prison dress was too large for her slender frame, and her feet were bare except for the rope sandals that were apparently standard issue for prisoners. She looked fragile and dangerous at the same time, like a wildfire banking itself but ready to flare at the first breath of wind. "Do you have any possessions you need to collect?" he asked when the papers were finally completed. "Only this." She held up the copy of Robinson Crusoe. Colonel Whitmore said I could keep it. "Of course," the colonel confirmed. "It's yours." "Then I am ready to leave whenever you are, Mr. Macready." The ride back to the ranch was conducted mostly in silence, though Caleb found himself hyper-aware of his companion's presence. Ayanna rode the spare horse he had brought with practiced ease, sitting straight in the saddle and scanning their surroundings with the constant alertness of someone accustomed to danger. She was also, he noticed, testing the horse's responsiveness and speed with subtle shifts in her weight and pressure from her legs. By the time they reached Willow Creek, she would know exactly what the animal was capable of in a crisis. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains when they crested the ridge that overlooked Caleb's valley. Below them, the creek wound through cottonwoods and willows, reflecting the sky like a ribbon of hammered silver. The ranch house sat in its meadow with smoke rising from the chimney. He had banked the fire that morning, and it was still burning. Cattle grazed in the distance, red and white dots scattered across the grassland, and Caleb felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing his animals healthy and well-fed. It was not much compared to the vast spreads farther east, but it was his, built with his own hands and maintained through his own labor. "It's beautiful," Ayanna said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. Her expression had changed for the first time since they had left the fort. The defensive wariness was still there, but underneath it he could see something that looked like longing, as if the sight of open country and running water called to something deep in her spirit. "The Apache had camps along this creek for generations," she added. "My grandfather used to tell stories about hunting elk in these meadows when he was young. I didn't know that. There are grinding stones near the big bend in the creek where the women used to process acorns and mesquite beans, and pictographs on the rocks above the spring where the creek starts." Caleb filed this information away, wondering what other history was written in the landscape around his home. He had always assumed he was the first to truly appreciate this valley, but apparently it had been loved and inhabited long before he arrived. "Your people don't come here anymore?" "My people are mostly dead or on reservations," Ayanna said flatly. "The living prefer to avoid places that hold too many ghosts." They rode down into the valley as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Caleb found himself seeing his home through her eyes, the solid house with its covered porch and stone chimney, The corrals and outbuildings arranged for efficiency and protection, the well-tended garden where he grew vegetables and herbs. It was a good life he had built here, productive and peaceful, but also solitary. Tonight, for the first time in months, there would be another voice at his dinner table and another presence to break the evening silence. Whether that would prove to be a blessing or a complication remained to be seen. The house felt different with another person in it, though Ayanna moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing unnecessarily and speaking only when spoken to. Caleb showed her to the small bedroom that had served as his office, hastily cleared of ledgers and ranch documents that afternoon while she waited outside. "The bed is narrow, but the mattress is new," he said, suddenly conscious of how sparse the furnishings were. A single window faced east toward the mountains, and the walls were bare except for a mirror and a wooden cross his sister had sent from Kansas. Ayanna examined the room with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to everything else, noting the window's height above the ground, the solid construction of the door frame, the proximity to the kitchen and back exit. "It will suffice," she said simply. Dinner was an awkward affair, despite Caleb's best efforts at conversation. He had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, but Ayanna ate sparingly, as if still accustomed to prison rations or perhaps testing the food for unfamiliar seasonings. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the property," he said, breaking a silence that had stretched too long. "You can get familiar with the layout, meet the horses, see what kind of work needs doing." "What time do you typically rise?" "Before dawn, usually. The animals need tending, and it's best to get the heavy work done before the heat becomes unbearable." Ayanna nodded. "I am accustomed to early mornings." After she retired to her room, Caleb sat on his porch listening to the night sounds of the desert coyotes calling from the ridges, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the constant whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. The familiar sounds should have been soothing, but tonight they only emphasized how much had changed in the space of a single day. He had shared his home with a woman before, briefly, when Mary Catherine Sullivan had followed him west from Missouri with promises of marriage and dreams of civilizing the frontier. That arrangement had lasted exactly 3 weeks before she decided that Arizona territory was too hot, too dangerous, and too far from anything resembling proper society. But Ayanna was different in ways he was only beginning to understand. She moved through his world without trying to change it, observed without judging, adapted without complaining. There was something almost unsettling about her composure, as if she were holding herself apart from circumstances that were merely temporary inconveniences. The next morning brought their first real test of the arrangement. Caleb rose at his usual hour, dressed quickly, and stepped outside to find Ayanna already awake, sitting on the porch steps watching the sunrise paint the eastern mountains gold and purple. She had somehow managed to wash and rebraid her hair, and her prison dress had been replaced by clothes that fit her properly, a simple blouse and riding skirt that he did not recognize. "Where did you get those clothes?" he asked, then immediately regretted the suspicious tone in his voice. "I made alterations to items I found in the trunk in my room," she replied calmly. "The previous occupant was approximately my size, though somewhat broader in the shoulders." Caleb remembered now he had stored some of Mary Catherine's abandoned belongings in that trunk, meaning to donate them to the church eventually, but never getting around to the task. The fact that Ayanna had transformed them into serviceable garments overnight spoke to skills he had not expected. "You sew?" Among other things, the missionary woman believed in practical education. She stood and brushed dust from her skirt with hands that bore calluses from work he could not identify. In the morning light, without the shadows of the jail cell, she looked younger and somehow more vulnerable, though no less formidable. "Shall we see to the animals?" she asked. The horses were pastured in a natural meadow where the creek made a wide bend, and they approached at the sound of Caleb's whistle. He had 6 animals, in total 4 working horses, a mare he was training for riding, and an old gelding that served as a companion animal for the others. Ayana studied each horse with the focused attention of someone who understood that her life might someday depend on their capabilities. She moved among them without fear, letting them smell her hands and speaking to them in Apache, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to calm even the most spirited animals. "This one," she said finally, resting her hand on the neck of a bay mare with intelligent eyes and powerful shoulders. "She has speed and endurance, and she trusts her own judgment." It was exactly the horse Caleb would have chosen for her, and exactly the one he had hoped she would not want. Sage was his best animal, trained for cattle work but capable of covering 50 miles in a day if necessary. "Are you certain?" "She can be difficult for inexperienced riders." Ayana's lips curved in what was definitely a smile this time, though it held no humor. "I have been riding since I could walk, Mr. Macready. I do not think your mare will present insurmountable challenges." To prove her point, she vaulted onto Sage's back without benefit of saddle or bridle, using only a handful of mane for leverage. The mare snorted and sidled nervously, testing this new rider, but Ayana set the movement easily and spoke a few words in Apache that seemed to settle the animal's concerns. "Satisfied?" she asked, sliding down with the same fluid grace she had shown mounting. "Satisfied," Caleb admitted, though he was beginning to suspect that keeping Ayana on his ranch might prove more challenging than he had anticipated. The morning's work included checking water sources, examining fence lines, and counting cattle in the near pastures. Ayana proved to be an able assistant, quick to understand what was needed and capable of handling tasks that would have challenged men twice her size. More importantly, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. Her reserved demeanor softened as they rode through country that was clearly familiar to her, and she occasionally pointed out features of the landscape that Caleb had never noticed: animal trails, seasonal water sources, places where the rock formations created natural shelter. "You know this land well," he observed as they paused to rest the horses beside a spring that bubbled up from the base of a red sandstone cliff. "My people traveled through this country for many generations. Every stone has a story, every tree a purpose." She dismounted and knelt beside the spring, cupping water in her hands to drink. "This place is called Singing Water in our language because of the sound the spring makes as it flows over the stones." Caleb listened and realized she was right. The water did create a musical sound as it cascaded down the rocks. He had passed this spot hundreds of times and never really heard it. "What other stories does this land hold?" Ayana glanced at him sideways, as if trying to determine whether his interest was genuine or merely polite conversation. "There," she said finally, pointing to a grove of oak trees on the far side of the meadow. "That is where my great-grandmother was born during a winter so harsh that the adults thought the child would not survive. But she grew to be the strongest woman in our band, and she lived to see 93 summers." "And there?" Caleb indicated a rocky outcrop that rose from the valley floor like the spine of some buried giant. "That is where Coyote tricked the sun into staying too long in the sky, causing the first drought. When the people complained, Coyote laughed and said they should be grateful for warmth. But when his own children began to die of thirst, he realized his mistake and spent 7 days singing the rain songs until the monsoons came." The stories continued throughout the morning, each one adding layers of meaning to landscape that Caleb had thought he understood. He began to realize that he had been living in a place rich with history and significance, but seeing only its surface. By midday, they had covered most of the ranch's boundaries and identified several tasks that needed attention: a section of fence damaged by elk, a water tank that required cleaning, a small herd of cattle that had drifted farther than usual from the main group. "We'll tackle the fence first," Caleb decided as they rode back toward the house for lunch. "It's important to keep the cattle from wandering onto government land." "The elk will only break it again," Ayana observed. They follow the same trails their ancestors used, regardless of human boundaries. Do you have a better solution? She considered the question seriously, her dark eyes scanning the terrain as if reading a map written in stone and vegetation. Build a fence to accommodate their passage. Leave gaps where the trails cross, with gates that can be closed when necessary but remain open most of the time. The elk will use their traditional paths, and your cattle will learn to respect the boundaries you establish in other places. It was an elegant solution, one that worked with natural patterns rather than against them. Caleb wondered why he had never thought of it himself. That might actually work. It will work. My people learned long ago that fighting the land is less effective than understanding it. They ate lunch in companionable silence, and Caleb found himself stealing glances at his unusual employee. In the space of a few hours, she had transformed from mysterious prisoner to knowledgeable partner, contributing ideas and insights that had never occurred to him. But he also sensed that she was still testing the situation, still evaluating whether this arrangement offered genuine opportunity or was simply another form of captivity with more comfortable accommodations. The afternoon brought their first real conflict. Caleb had decided to tackle the water tank cleaning, a job that required climbing into the wooden structure and scrubbing away several months' worth of algae and debris. It was hot, messy work, but necessary to ensure clean drinking water for the cattle. I'll handle this, he said, stripping off his shirt and preparing to climb into the tank. No need for both of us to get soaked. I am smaller and will be more efficient in the confined space, Ayanna replied, already rolling up her sleeves. It's not appropriate work for a woman. The words were out of his mouth before he could consider their implications, and the effect on Ayanna was immediate and unmistakable. Her expression went from cooperative to coldly furious in the space of a heartbeat. Not appropriate for a woman? She repeated, her voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that wise men learn to fear. I have skinned buffalo, built houses, tracked wounded warriors through mountain terrain that would kill most of your cavalry soldiers, and survived 3 months in military prison without losing my sanity. But cleaning a water tank is beyond my delicate feminine capabilities. Caleb realized his mistake immediately, but the damage was already done. That's not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. Ayanna stepped closer, and despite giving up nearly a foot in height, she somehow managed to seem intimidating. You meant that there are limitations to what you will allow me to do, regardless of my abilities or willingness. You meant that your offer of employment comes with conditions that have nothing to do with the work itself. I was trying to be considerate. You were trying to put me in a category you could understand and control. The helpful woman who cooks your meals and mends your clothes, but does not presume to do man's work or challenge your assumptions about how things should be done. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Caleb had indeed been thinking about appropriate roles and proper behavior, concepts that had never seemed important when he lived alone but suddenly felt essential now that he was responsible for another person's welfare. You're right, he said finally. That was exactly what I was doing, and I apologize. Ayanna blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct acknowledgement. I'm accustomed to making all the decisions about ranch work, Caleb continued. It's going to take me some time to adjust to having a partner instead of an employee. A partner? Someone whose opinions and capabilities I respect, whose contributions I value, whose judgment I trust. He met her eyes directly. If you're willing to be patient while I learn to live up to that definition. For a long moment, they stood facing each other beside the water tank, the afternoon heat shimmering around them and tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Then Ayanna nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow conveyed both acceptance and warning. I will clean the tank, she said, because I am better suited to the task and because efficiency benefits us both. Agreed. She climbed into the tank with the fluid grace that characterized all her movements, and set to work with a focused intensity that made conversation unnecessary. Caleb found himself admiring not only her competence, but also her willingness to forgive, his momentary lapse into conventional thinking. The work progressed quickly under her efficient approach, and by late afternoon, the tank was clean and refilled with fresh water from the spring. Ayanna emerged soaked and grimy, but obviously satisfied with the results. "Better?" she asked, wringing water from her hair. "Much better. Thank you. It was necessary work." "Thanks are not required." But something had shifted between them during the confrontation and its resolution. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by a more honest dynamic that acknowledged both conflict and cooperation as natural parts of working together. That evening, Ayanna prepared dinner using ingredients from Caleb's pantry, but methods that were clearly her own. The result was unlike anything he had tasted. Familiar flavors, combined in unexpected ways that somehow improved both the individual components and the overall meal. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, helping himself to a second portion of what she called succotash, but which bore little resemblance to any succotash he had previously encountered. "Hunger is an excellent teacher," she replied. "When you must make satisfying meals from whatever is available, you learn to be creative with combinations." "Is that another lesson from the missionary woman?" "That is a lesson from 3 years of hiding in the mountains while cavalry patrols tried to force us onto reservations." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Caleb heard the underlying hardships in her simple statement. "Tell me about those years," he said gently. Ayanna was quiet for so long that he began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the distant quality of someone revisiting memories that were both precious and painful. "We lived like ghosts in our own country, moving constantly, never building fires large enough to be seen from a distance, never staying in one place long enough to leave traces that could be followed. The children learned to walk without making sound, to cry without making noise. The old ones died because we could not stop long enough to care for them properly." She paused, staring into the flame of the oil lamp as if seeing faces there. "We survived by becoming what the soldiers said. We were savage and unpredictable. But we also lost what we had been, a people with homes and traditions and the luxury of planning for tomorrow." "Why didn't you surrender earlier?" "Because surrender meant death of a different kind. Not the quick death of bullets, but the slow death of becoming something other than what we were meant to be." She looked up at him directly. "You have never been told that everything you believe is wrong, that your way of life is primitive and must be abandoned, that your children will be better off if they are taken from you and taught to be ashamed of their parents. Until you have faced that choice, you cannot understand why we preferred the mountains." Caleb found himself without adequate words to respond. His own experience of hardship, the struggle to establish a ranch, the loneliness of bachelor life, the constant challenge of making a living from difficult land seemed insignificant compared to the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. "I'm sorry," he said finally, knowing the words were inadequate but meaning them sincerely. "Do not apologize for things you did not do," Ayanna replied, "but do not forget them either. Understanding the past makes it possible to choose a different future." They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, and afterward, Ayanna helped clean the dishes without being asked. The domestic routine felt surprisingly natural, as if they had been sharing meals and chores for years rather than days. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Caleb found himself thinking about the future she had mentioned. What kind of future was possible for a woman caught between two worlds, neither of which seemed to have a place for her? "What do you want?" he asked suddenly, the question emerging from his thoughts without conscious decision. "Want?" From life, from this arrangement, from whatever comes next. Ayanna considered the question with the same serious attention she gave to everything else. "I want to wake up each morning knowing that the day belongs to me," she said eventually. "I want to make choices based on my own judgment rather than someone else's expectations. I want to use my skills and knowledge for purposes that matter to me. And if you could have all of that?" Then I might begin to believe that freedom is something more than the absence of chains. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats echoing across the valley in the still night air. Caleb rose quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept beside the door. "How many?" Ayanna asked, her voice calm but alert. "3, maybe 4. Moving fast but not trying to hide their approach. Military?" Caleb listened to the rhythm of the hoofbeats, analyzing the pace and pattern with skills developed through years of frontier living. "Possibly. Or men who learned to ride in the military." Ayanna was already moving, slipping into the house with the silent efficiency that had served her well during her years of hiding. When she returned, she carried a knife that had definitely not been part of the kitchen equipment Caleb had showed her. "Where did you get that?" "I made it from a piece of metal I found in the barn." A woman should never be completely without weapons. The riders came into view as they crested the ridge above the house. 4 men on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the star-filled sky. They rode with the disciplined formation of soldiers, but they wore civilian clothes and carried themselves with the easy confidence of men accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Mac ready." The lead rider's voice carried clearly across the valley. "We need to talk." Caleb recognized the voice now. Jake Brennan, a rancher from the other side of the territorial capital, and a man with strong opinions about Indian policy that did not align with charitable interpretations of federal law. "What do you want, Brennan?" Caleb called back, not moving from his position on the porch. "We want to discuss your new hired help," Brennan replied, steering his horse closer to the house. "Folks in town are concerned about having an Apache killer living among decent people." Caleb felt Ayanna tense beside him, though she made no sound and showed no visible reaction to the implied threat. "Miss Crow Feather is here legally, with proper territorial authorization," he replied evenly. "Her employment status is none of your concern. Everything that affects the safety of our families is our concern." This from one of the other riders, a man Caleb did not recognize but whose tone suggested he was accustomed to having his concerns taken seriously. "What exactly are you proposing?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We're proposing that you send her back to the fort where she belongs," Brennan said, his horse dancing nervously as if picking up on its rider's agitation. "Before something unfortunate happens that could have been prevented." The threat was clear enough, though couched in language that provided plausible deniability. Caleb felt anger building in his chest, not the quick flare of temper that came from personal insult, but the cold, steady fury that came from watching injustice disguised as concerned citizenship. "And if I decline your suggestion, then you'll be responsible for whatever consequences follow." Ayanna stepped forward then, moving into the lamplight where the riders could see her clearly. She held the knife casually, not in a threatening manner, but in a way that made it clear she was prepared to use it if necessary. "I am responsible for my own consequences," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "and I am prepared to face them." The 4 horses shied nervously, responding to their rider's sudden tension. Caleb realized that none of these men had expected to be confronted by their target directly, and they were not sure how to respond to a woman who showed no fear of their implied threats. "You don't understand the situation you're in, girl," Brennan said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that certain men used when addressing women they considered beneath their notice. "I understand it perfectly," Ayanna replied. 4 men who lack the courage to state their intentions clearly have ridden to a stranger's property in the dark to deliver threats. They hope will not be recognized as such. The situation is quite familiar to me. We're trying to prevent bloodshed." "Whose blood?" Ayanna asked mildly. "Mine, Mr. Macready's, or your own?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Caleb could see the riders exchanging glances as they realized that their easy intimidation was not proceeding according to plan. "You've got spine, I'll give you that," Brennan said finally. "But spine won't stop a bullet." "No," Ayanna agreed calmly. but skill with a knife will stop the man who fires it if he is foolish enough to come within range. It was not an idle boast, and something in her tone convinced the riders that she meant every word. The horses continued to dance nervously, and one of the men muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. "This isn't over," Brennan declared, gathering his reins with hands that were not entirely steady. "No," Caleb said quietly, "it's not. But the next time you want to discuss my business arrangements, I suggest you come during daylight hours and leave your friends at home." The riders wheeled their horses and departed as quickly as they had arrived, their hoofbeats fading into the distance until only the normal sounds of the desert night remained. "Well," Ayanna said, sliding her knife back into whatever concealment she had fashioned for it. That was illuminating. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "I should have anticipated something like this." "Why?" "You cannot control the fears and prejudices of other people, only your own response to them. They'll be back. Probably, but not tonight, and possibly not as confidently as they came the first time." Caleb found himself studying his unusual employee with new respect. She had faced down 4 armed men with nothing but a homemade knife and absolute composure, turning a situation that could have escalated into violence into a demonstration of resolve that had sent the would-be intimidators away with their tails between their legs. "Where did you learn to handle confrontation like that?" "From necessity," Ayanna replied, "and from watching how effective calm confidence can be against bluster and empty threats." They went inside eventually, but Caleb found sleep difficult. He lay in his bed listening for sounds that did not belong, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake that would endanger them both, and trying to understand why Ayanna's safety had become so important to him in such a short time. In the room across the hall, Ayanna was having similar thoughts, though her concerns ran in different directions. She had found something here that she had not expected, not just employment or a temporary refuge, but the possibility of partnership with a man who seemed willing to treat her as an equal rather than a curiosity or a problem to be managed. But she also knew that such possibilities were fragile things, easily destroyed by forces beyond their control. Men like Brennan did not make idle threats, and they had friends in territorial government who shared their views about the proper place of Indians in Arizona society. The question was whether what they were building here was strong enough to survive the challenges that were surely coming. Outside, coyotes called from the ridges, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods beside the creek, carrying scents of sage and juniper and the lingering warmth of sun-baked stone. It was a beautiful night in a beautiful place, but beauty had never been sufficient protection against human hatred and fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in months, Ayanna Crowfeather fell asleep in a bed she had chosen, in a house where she was welcome, beside a creek that sang the old songs of her people. It was not freedom yet, but it was close enough to taste.